And then I'm going to share my slides with you. So my hope that everyone can see this. Welcome everyone to this very special edition of my regular Tuesday night sessions with the Women Who Want Muscle. This is an online lifting community, and every week I provide some form of teaching on training and our bodies. And this topic, as part of this month's series of learning about our bodies, things like what it takes to gain muscle, what it takes to lose fat. And the topic is metabolic disease and insulin resistance. And in putting it together, it required a lot more research on my part as to how to explain things and put things into diagrams. So a lot more architecture, if you will. And then I started thinking, you know what? It's so important that a wider audience hears this, that I decided to open up the talk to the general public. Now, the call is fairly large, so we may do better if everyone's video is off to preserve the bandwidth of the call. And I would appreciate that you keep your microphone on mute. So this will help reduce the background noise. There will be moments when I pause what I'm saying, and I'll invite people to ask questions at that time. So don't forget to unmute yourself. It's helpful to introduce yourself and just ask your question. You can also type things in the chat box. So there is an icon with a little chat box at the bottom of your screen. You might want to become familiar with it, but don't worry. If you can't use it, that's fine. You can always just speak your questions. And I do welcome questions. Please don't hesitate to ask. So tonight, the topic is metabolic disease and insulin resistance. Terms that you may have come across, but maybe are confused about what they actually mean. And there's a number of interrelated terms that you may come across: metabolic disease, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and type 2 diabetes. Are they all one and the same thing? How are they related? We're going to get to the bottom of that tonight. So our mission tonight is to understand something called insulin resistance as a disease in evolution, and to appreciate how it really gets going and gets started, and understand some of the most important elements in prevention and treatment. Now, I will say this: many of you are aware that I am a physician. I'm stating this disclaimer. It does not substitute for individual medical evaluation or treatment. If you're at all concerned about your health, please seek medical attention from your physician. So we're going to start the talk off by defining the most broad or non-specific of the terms: metabolic disease. So in order to understand a disease of metabolism, we first have to know what metabolism is. And I think even that term is not well understood by people. Your metabolism essentially comprises all of the various complex biochemical reactions and pathways that happen inside each and every one of your cells that takes the energy present in the chemical bonds of the food and converts them into usable energy for your body. That is to say, a molecule called ATP. And everything in metabolism is designed to take that chemical energy, break it up into usable forms, deliver it where it needs to go, store it when needed, release it as needed, and basically manage the flux of energy. So all of that is metabolism. So obviously, a disease of that process can happen at any number of stages, and therefore comprises hundreds upon thousands of different diseases, some of which are defects in single enzymes and can affect something apparent at birth, so a genetic condition that is manifest when someone is born, but the vast majority of them are acquired over the course of your life as a result of exposures and the way you live your life. Now I want to talk about what metabolic syndrome is. It is by far and away the most common form of acquired metabolic disease. So if you think about metabolic diseases, metabolic syndrome is the most common type that you acquire as a result of your lifestyle. Now, many of you likely are familiar with the fact that if you have family members with this or family members with type 2 diabetes, that you're likely to develop this. There are genetic contributions, and genetics have a way of predisposing you to this type of illness, but they are not a destiny. So it's important to distinguish the fact that if you have certain genes, living a certain way predisposes you to developing this more easily than someone who doesn't have those genes. It puts you at higher risk, but it doesn't mean you're destined to have it. Okay? Now, a syndrome is basically a constellation of signs and symptoms. So a collection of things that when they start to coexist, we recognize that as a disease, and that's how we make a diagnosis. Because for some conditions, there's no specific single diagnostic test. So the more of these signs and symptoms you have, the more likely it is that you have this disease. So the metabolic syndrome is the presence of at least 3 or up to 5 of the following things: an increase in your waist circumference as a manifestation of increasing amounts of fat in and around the abdominal organs, also called visceral fat; the presence of elevations of your blood pressure, elevations of blood sugar, elevations of your blood triglycerides, and low HDL, the good cholesterol. So the more of these you have, the more likely you have metabolic syndrome. And this is by far and away, it's estimated that about 20% of the American population now lives with this, and Canadian statistics, although less accessible to me, when I look into the literature, we're never far behind. The underlying pathophysiology, meaning the disease mechanism, how this comes to be, is related to a condition called insulin resistance. It begins with resistance to the hormone insulin. So if we're going to understand insulin resistance, we first must really be clear on what insulin is and what it does in a normal, healthy body. So insulin is a hormone that's secreted by your pancreas, which is an organ that sits in your abdomen behind your stomach. And it secretes insulin along with digestive enzymes after eating. So whenever you take in any type of energy, insulin is secreted along with digestive enzymes to deal with the incoming energy. Remember that it's the job of metabolism to take stored chemical bonds in food and bring them to where they're needed so that they can be used and turned into ATP. Insulin is the main driver and master regulator of that process after eating. It takes nutrients and delivers them to where they need to go. We know it best by the fact that it regulates blood sugar to stay within a very normal range, and that's essential to life. Not having sufficient or any insulin is incompatible with existence and quickly leads to life-threatening emergencies. This we know from conditions where insulin is not secreted in sufficient amounts to keep us alive, or it's not secreted at all. And in the lead up to this talk, someone asked me whether type 1 diabetes would be a relevant part of what I was discussing. And it's not the same because it falls in this category of conditions where insulin is missing. And that can happen from a genetic cause, like type 1 diabetes, in which you develop an autoimmune condition that's genetically based, that attacks the pancreas and prevents it from functioning normally. But you can also acquire this condition. For example, if you have advanced pancreatic cancer, you'll display the same abnormality. You're not producing insulin normally. And we know what happens in this environment. You get very high blood sugars and ketoacidosis, which can cause death. So these people need insulin. This is quite different than saying people are resistant to insulin. Resistance to insulin requires that insulin is there. So it's a different thing, different discussion. The main targets of insulin are 3 tissues: muscle, fat, and liver. These are the main regulators of metabolism. But it's important to remember that insulin has other effects in the body, much more complicated. And everything I'm telling you is a very simplified explanation of the body. But insulin also has growth-promoting tissues. The best example of this, and the most relevant one in our group, who are a bunch of lifters, is that it stimulates the growth of muscle. It helps to take nutrients into muscle cells and grow them. In regards to its actions in the bloodstream, let's take a look at what happens under normal circumstances after you eat a meal to your blood sugar or blood glucose. These are interchangeable, okay? These, and I'm going to use them interchangeably. On the y-axis here is your blood sugar, okay? And it's in American units. So if you don't recognize the units, that's because in Canada we use millimoles per liter. And you might recognize numbers like 5 or 6. And that would be your blood sugar at the beginning when you've been fasting and before you eat. Then in minutes after you eat, your blood sugar starts to rise in your bloodstream. And as a response, insulin is secreted by the pancreas. Your blood sugar reaches a peak at about an hour after you eat and then starts to come down, assuming insulin's been secreted, and helps to deliver that blood sugar where it needs to go, i.e. inside cells. So if insulin's doing its job, blood glucose comes down back to normal within 2 hours. It's important to remember that insulin isn't only secreted in response to eating sugar and carbohydrate foods, because it has roles in storing every type of nutrient. It's a common misconception, and people assume that insulin's role is very sort of narrow. It delivers all nutrients to the cells. So incoming glucose is the result of eating carbohydrate foods that are broken into glucose molecules. It also stores fatty acids, which are the breakdown products of dietary fat. It also helps to store amino acids that are breakdown products of dietary protein. And after we eat, our potassium in the blood goes up and insulin regulates that as well. Okay? So again, insulin's role is on 3 main tissues, and I want to focus in on its role on these tissues in some detail. It acts on muscle, liver, and fat as it pertains to energy and food distribution. So let's look at the muscle cell. Please don't freak out, okay? I'm going to lead you through this diagram. Follow along based on what I'm saying and try not to read the words. So this is the surface of a muscle cell, okay? And on the surface are some receptors for insulin. And when you've eaten a meal, glucose or blood sugar is high and insulin is secreted. And that's on the outside of the muscle cell and in the bloodstream. When insulin comes in contact with the receptor on the surface of the muscle cell, it activates that receptor, and the activation of that receptor sends the signal inside the muscle cell to put a channel into the membrane of the muscle cell that is like a doorway to allow glucose or blood sugar to come into the muscle cell. This has the impact of lowering the blood sugar level and increasing the intracellular muscle glucose. This is how working muscles get what they need. Not only that, but once it's in the cell, glucose needs a destination. It's built up into glycogen molecules. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose. It's just long chains of sugar put together. And it's put there as a storage form of sugar for later use. Remember this, insulin is also doing other things. It's helping to store lipids, in other words, fats as like fat molecules, and helping to promote protein synthesis. So think about insulin as ringing a doorbell on the muscle cell, and the door opens to glucose. Does that make sense, hopefully? I'll pause for questions in a moment. We're going to go to the liver cell now, where insulin has very similar roles, but not entirely the same. The liver is a very complex organ. It's the master regulator of your metabolism. Here in the liver cell, much the same thing happens. After you eat and insulin and glucose are high, the insulin binds to an insulin receptor here as well. The signal is sent to open a channel to allow glucose to come in. And as well, that glucose, once it's inside the liver cell, is built into glycogen molecules where glycogen can be stored as well. It also has the role, insulin, of turning off a process called gluconeogenesis, which is the production of glucose from other things. The liver has a wonderful, beautiful ability to take non-sugar molecules and build sugar. I'm going to ask a question. Does anyone know why it's critically important to be able to do this? If we store glycogen and it can be broken down when we're not eating and create sugar for later on, why is it so important to be able to create glucose another way? Anna?
To have a source of energy to produce the ATP you're talking about?
Always. We need it to survive. So think about the fact that glycogen, we can only carry around so much. Once it's gone, and if it's gone, we would have no other way of producing glucose, which is a source of energy. And does anyone know which organ is critically dependent on a steady source of glucose, and without it, we would rapidly die? Anna?
I'm guessing here some type of heart muscle.
Maybe not.
Something muscular. I don't know. Or brain.
Ah!
Sorry.
Lucy piped in. She wrote the
Yes.
brain. The brain is critically dependent on glucose. It's the primary energy source for the brain. There's another critical organ, though, that relies on a different energy source, and that is fatty acids. Do you know which? You said it, the heart. So the heart actually steadily beats all day long, every single minute of every single day of our lives, and actually runs mainly on fatty acids. Fatty acids are a different form of fuel, which also go into the liver, as you see in the diagram. So I'm going to draw your eyes back to the diagram. The fatty acids are coming in, and the liver's job is to take those, build them into triglycerides, which are fat molecules, and send them out to every other organ that's stored, well, not other organs ideally, fat molecules or fat cells that store it for later. And the way it travels in the bloodstream is in a molecule or a particle called VLDL, very low density lipoprotein. So when you go to the doctor and you get blood work done, and they're testing your blood lipid panel, that is a measurement of your triglycerides, okay? And it goes up when insulin is up. So those are the kinds of things that are going on in the liver. Now, what's happening in the fat cell? The fat cell is also called an adipocyte, okay? And insulin is driving fatty acids into the fat cell for storage. So fatty acids, remember, are the breakdown products of fat from your diet. They're re-esterified, which just means that they're put back together and recreated into a fat molecule that is stored in the fat cell. And that process is indicated here in the blue arrow, re-esterification, taking fat breakdown products and restoring fat molecules that go into the fat cell. There's another process by which you can make fat from non-fat things. So too much glucose hanging around will be put into the fat cell as fat by a process called de novo lipogenesis. That's a weaker way in which we form fat. Most of our fat is created from dietary fat. And of course, insulin would then need to shut off lipolysis, a process of breaking down the fat, because it would make no sense to do both at the same time. That would be opposing its own action. So it's responsible for storage, putting the fat into this fat cell, therefore turning off fat burning. I call it burning, but what it is breaking it into fatty acids again at the other side. Okay, so that's all in the fed state, meaning after we've eaten and within 2 hours of eating, and assuming that our hormones and metabolism are normal, within 2 hours, that process is all said and done. Now we're fasting. We need blood sugar and we need fatty acids. We need sugar mainly for the brain, but also for every working muscle. We need fatty acids for the heart, and we need energy when we're not eating. We spend time foraging for food, gathering, hunting, building shelter, looking after offspring. The human body needs to develop a way to stay alive when it's not eating. And that's where the counter-regulatory hormones come in, because they do the exact opposite of what insulin does. And they release all that stored energy. So they break that glycogen down back into glucose. They break the fat particles into fatty acids. And so insulin, when it's down, these go up, and they work in a counterbalancing way. Low insulin states help to release stored energy. Okay, that's an important piece of background teaching. That's what insulin normally does. I'd like to pause and ask if anyone has questions about what I've just covered. There are no stupid questions, please. Any question that you have, it's quite likely that many others have the same question. Does that make sense? Okay, so 3 main tissues where it stores energy after eating. Pretty straightforward. Good. Thanks for the thumbs up. It helps me. So now now that we know a little bit about insulin and how it normally behaves, we can talk a bit about what happens when this thing called insulin resistance occurs. Insulin resistance is basically an impairment of the ability of those cells to respond normally to insulin. Okay, so the liver and fat and muscle don't respond in a normal way to the available insulin. And this condition is a known silent precursor of diabetes. Long before you develop elevations of your blood sugar, in fact, decades before, you have been insulin resistant for a long time. And it's silent because we don't have diagnostic tests or we don't perform them to diagnose this problem. And it's currently quite an epidemic. It's estimated that half of Americans now live with this condition. That's tremendous. And it is believed to be the foundational metabolic disturbance that predisposes to all the other 4 horsemen. And if you don't understand the reference, the 4 horsemen are the chronic diseases of modern society that we're seeing in epidemic proportions. Like the prevalence is rising tremendously fast. And they're diseases of lifestyle, okay? And they're all, the underpinning of all of these is thought to start with insulin resistance. In cardiovascular disease, the presence of elevations of insulin and ultimately then fatty acids in the bloodstream and too much glucose fundamentally end up stiffening arteries, causing fat accumulation in the walls of the arteries, blockages leading to heart attacks and strokes. Metabolic disease and diabetes is what we're discussing. Neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, diseases of the brain, and even mental health conditions, they're increasingly recognizing show evidence that the brain cells are behaving in an insulin-resistant manner. And cancer cells have disordered metabolism as well, many of them displaying resistance. And of course, high insulin levels can feed cancer cells. So you're going to see how resistance can lead to a lot of the disorders that are modern day killers. So it's really important to tackle this at its very roots. Okay, so what happens at the level of, let's go back to our diagrams and start to try and understand what's happening when insulin resistance occurs. Let's go back to the muscle cell. Now insulin is there and glucose is there. Insulin is binding to its receptor and the receptor gets activated, but somehow the signal is lost. There's no response to open the door. It's almost like insulin has now stopped ringing the doorbell and started banging hard on the door. And it's trying to get this door to open. And if you push and bang and knock long enough and hard enough, you can still get it to work. So the first thing that happens is that the glucose doesn't initially go in very easily. Insulin's binding, glucose still hanging around outside in the bloodstream. So guess what the pancreas does? It cranks up more insulin because it figures, hey, the blood sugar is still lying here. We need to get rid of it. What's going on? The response of the pancreas is a normal response to the fact that glucose is sticking around in the bloodstream. So insulin levels go even higher, and that can, for a period of time, compensate, meaning eventually the signal gets through and some glucose comes in, but there is impairment in this process such that more insulin is needed to do the initial job. And the thinking, and there are biochemists and molecular biochemists who are studying this, who have come to the conclusion based on all of their research over 20, 30 years, probably even longer, But the prevailing theory is now that there are too many fat metabolites in this muscle cell. So when a muscle cell starts to have fat inside of it, that breakdown of fat is leading to something that's gumming up this signal from the insulin receptor to the opening of the glucose doorway, let's say. Why is fat in the muscle cell is the question. It may shock you to know that they've done a study on young, lean undergraduate males. This is a study that was published, I think, sometime in the 70s, but don't quote me on that. The point is that they found that these young, lean males, they were in their 20s, had evidence of this process going on in the muscle cell, and they were not people who had a high level of body fat. What they did have, though, was that they were sedentary, and they showed evidence of fat inside the muscle. And it's thought that this is what is leading, and they've then done studies to show that metabolites are in fact interfering with this. So the presence of muscle fat is a problem and kicks off with sedentarism, meaning low levels of physical activity. In the liver, what happens when you don't have insulin is much the same. The liver is now being exposed to high levels of insulin, because remember, muscle is the most insulin sensitive organ in our bodies. We have more of it than anything else, more of it than the liver. And it is primarily responsive to insulin. And when that is not working properly because of what I just told you, fat in the muscle, and interfering with that, there's insulin levels that are going up, and the other organs are being exposed to this. And essentially then what happens is that the liver is exposed to high levels of insulin after eating a meal, such that it develops excessive accumulations of fat, because remember that insulin is driving fatty acids into this liver. That was one of the functions, remember? So now the liver is saying, okay, well, I'm going to churn out more triglyceride. That's my job when insulin is hanging around. So off we go. We export more lipid molecules into the bloodstream. And lo and behold, these folks start to develop elevations in their blood triglyceride levels. And you can see storage of fat inside the liver cell. And when that happens, you get problems with liver function. You can get inflammation of the liver. And ultimately, down the road, with enough fat storage in the liver, you get non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And that is now the #1 cause of end-stage liver disease in the United States. That's staggering, because even when I was in medical school, that was like maybe, 10% of the reason people needed a transplant. And the crazy thing is that no one can get a healthy liver because everyone has fatty liver, which you don't transplant. So we're in trouble. The liver is storing so much fat because of hyperinsulinemia, high circulating levels of insulin. So all of this is happening at the liver. And ultimately also obviously causes insulin resistance in the liver. So because the same mechanism will happen where you don't open the glucose door for the same reason. Fat inside the liver will cause that. Then when you look at the fat cell, what's happening is insulin is saying, okay, store fat into fat cells. Store. That's the job of insulin. And remember why the insulin is too high, it hangs around too long, is because the muscle cell's not responding. Sandy, I see your hand, and I'll just finish this, and I'll ask you to share your question in a moment. But remember that under normal circumstances, the blue arrow is where most of your fat is being produced. It turns out that when insulin's very high, it will then take some of that glucose that's hanging around too much. Remember how it's not going into muscle cell? Well, where's it going to go? It's going to go to fat, because this process of de novo lipogenesis is now becoming more important to deal with the excess glucose that's lying around. So you get all this extra fat deposition. And remember the other rule of insulin, when it's quite high, it turns off lipolysis, so you're not getting the fat breakdown. So remember now that if you're insulin resistant, you're going to require higher levels of insulin to do the normal job of bringing your blood glucose down after eating. And the chances are that the levels are very high and stay higher than they should for longer. And you're getting all this happening that's distorting what should normally happen. Insulin goes up a little bit, comes down within 2 hours, and allows eventually the release of this energy from fat cells. Sandy, don't forget to unmute yourself to ask your question. Sandy, are you there? You need to unmute yourself because we can't hear you. Maybe we'll come back to Sandy. Donna has a question. Hi, Donna.
I do. And it's a spoiler alert. I'm going to ask the ending. Are you going to tell us by the end of this talk how to fix these things? Because I recognize the symptoms and I just want to make sure there's going to be a happy ending.
There is absolutely an ending.
Yeah, that's all I needed to know. Thank you so much.
Oh, stay tuned.
So
We're halfway through. Don't worry. Okay, Sandy, if you can type in the chat box as an alternative to trying to activate your microphone, maybe that would be an alternative way to ask the question. Sorry about that. So now what do people experience? Well, with this syndrome, they have fatigue, food cravings, because again, think about it. You've got sugar in the bloodstream, but not in the cells. So in fact, this causes disruptions of appetite because essentially you have cells that are like effectively starving in the presence of plentiful nutrients. So then you start eating more. And doesn't that seem like a cruel combination with what's already happening, which is store fat, but don't put your glucose anywhere. Start storing the glucose as fat. You have foggy brain, low energy, and typically then over time, because of the fat accumulation in the liver, it starts to getting exported and it has nowhere to go. So it starts going in your organs, like it starts living around your kidneys and your spleen. And, you do have measurements of your blood lipids. Triglycerides are high. And for reasons I'm not going to get into, because cholesterol metabolism is extremely complicated, it also drives your good cholesterol down. Sylvain, did you have a question?
Yes, you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So just a bit of a challenge for me to follow all the theory, but talking about fat and insulin, when you do a lot of exercise and you burn a lot of fat, what effect does that have on insulin?
You guys want to get to the ending, so bear with me. We're talking about what happens in normal in the diseased person with insulin resistance. Remember that I said that it kicks off with fat in the muscle because of sedentary behavior.
Okay.
It's not just sedentary behavior. Obviously, you're more likely to accumulate fat when you combine sedentary behavior with an excess of energy coming in versus energy going out. So when you eat more energy than you need, it has nowhere to go but be stored. And so it's a combination. So bear with me, everyone. You're eager to get to the punchline, and I understand that. But this is a decades-long process whereby the processes or the disease things that are happening initially that we've described are in the blue zone. And you can have this for decades before ultimately. So again, it's muscle insulin resistance that's sought to kick everything off and leads to postprandial hyperinsulinemia, meaning after eating a meal, your insulin levels have to be jacked up so much higher to deal with the fact that the muscle is not responding. And so you get this effect of having high insulin after eating. We don't test that. If we did test insulin after a meal, we might detect this. Then you have liver insulin resistance as a consequence of this high level of insulin circulating. The liver then starts to misbehave. And when the liver starts storing and exporting more fat, you get into this phase. And this phase is illustrated by high triglycerides, low HDL, and a fatty liver. ultimately, then this leads to a failure to manage the glucose at all. So now there's banging on the door, and more insulin can now no longer do the job. You've lost control, and blood sugar actually does go up after eating. And if you've had, if you've been pregnant, not for the men, but you've had a test where you drink the glucose and they test your blood levels of sugar to see whether it comes down in a normal way. You can develop this postprandial hyperglycemia in pregnancy as a form of resistance, but this is the same test that would apply here. So looking at how someone responds after eating, what is the response to insulin? Have we lost control now? It's not just insulin's high, it's very high, but it's no longer enough to bring the sugar down. So the sugar goes up. And then you ultimately have high sugar when you're not even eating. And that's when you officially have type 2 diabetes. So it's a spectrum and they're all related. And this is what people's blood sugar profile looks like after eating. If you have a normal response to insulin, it's a small blip in blood sugar that comes quickly down to normal within 2 hours, as we said. If you're pre-diabetic, meaning you're in the gray zone, but you haven't quite hit diabetes, you have normal blood sugar when you're fasting, but after eating, you have an exaggerated hump here. That's not good. It means that your insulin is no longer working, and it hasn't been working for a long time. And you can get these dips afterwards where people feel low blood sugar and they feel shaky and hungry, and they're actually prone to eating again within a short period of time, and they get very carb starved because they want blood sugar quickly. And it's a phenomenon that's related to this. And then fundamentally, when you're fully diabetic, you no longer have normal blood sugars even before eating, and they don't come down at all after eating. So you need supplemental medication and insulin. So Sandy, did you find a way to unmute your microphone to ask a question, or no? I'm going to move on now. So we think the evolving picture is that sedentary behavior leads to this problem in the muscle that's then compounded by too much energy coming in through the diet. So when it comes to diet, what is the culprit? And everybody wants to point to sugar because clearly it's a sugar problem. Well, you can see that it isn't that simple, right? It's really an excess of a lot of energy coming in, fat and sugar both, right? Think of typical foods that we eat in our diet, in North American diets, convenience foods, tasty foods. They typically combine these things in high quantities. So like, I've listed some examples, but pizzas and creamy pastas and sandwiches that are made with big white bread, melted cheese, and meat. They're also delectable because our palate is wired to our brain to desire those very high energy foods, because evolutionarily speaking, we didn't have access to much energy, and we spent all day running around building houses for ourselves and trying to find the food. When we did find it, we had to eat it in copious amounts. We seek that food. It's pleasurable for survival's sake. But in our society where these tastes are combined in very intense forms, we tend to be exposed to highly palatable foods that cause overconsumption of energy. So all you need is a few bites and already you've had like more than enough energy by virtue of the density of energy in these foods. Think cookies, donuts, pastries, they all have oils with sugar, and these things appeal. And the combination is detrimental because of how much energy is coming in. So don't be confused about whether a specific diet leads to this. Remember what we're talking about. It starts with the fact that muscle has fat in it, likely from being sedentary. We know that from some populations who are not yet over fat, but have insulin resistance in the muscle. So not using your muscles, and then having too much energy coming in. And this is not typically happening if you're eating a healthy whole food diet. So the North American lifestyle is really a perfect storm. We have sedentary jobs increasingly because more of our work has been delegated to a computer. So we sit all day, and we build cities with suburbs where we have to commute in sedentary ways to the center of the city to do our sedentary job. We don't build sidewalks, bike lanes, and we don't make it commuter friendly to do these things by active means. So in order to shop or work, we need a car. And because so much of our time is spent in a car trying to get from A to B, we're rushed. And we rush so much that we don't have time to deliberately move our bodies in physically active ways. And we rely more and more on convenience foods because we simply don't have time. Not to mention that when we're tired and busy, those foods provide a lot of comfort. They release hormones in the brain that are very comforting and make us feel good. And so we seek them when we're overworked, stressed, tired, and busy. So this is just a big, huge, systematic problem. So knowing what you know now, I'm putting the question to you. Knowing what you know now about what triggers this, what is the best way to prevent it? I'm going to come back to Donna. Donna, are you willing to venture, I guess?
Oh, yeah, get moving.
Okay.
I could see that coming too, I will say.
Okay, good. Well, that was the point. I wanted to make this absolutely crystal clear. We fix this through physical activity. It's the absolute essential cornerstone. And I'm going to tell you another reason why, not just because now you know what kicks it off, but it turns out that when you work your muscle, it creates an insulin bypass channel. Yes, active working muscles have a backdoor for glucose that doesn't rely on the insulin receptor. So even if that is gummed up, you have a back door that will circumvent it. And it's so powerful, this mechanism, that people with established diabetes, either type 1 or advanced type 2, have managed their disease with little to no insulin just by exercising after eating. So going for a brisk walk after a meal vastly improves blood sugar responses, even in insulin-resistant people, because it's a totally separate bypass mechanism. Long term, we need to do two things. Adding muscle, why? Because obviously, first of all, this will help clear the fat out of muscle. If you replace muscle fat with muscle protein by building muscles, you're going to reverse the disease that kicks this off, which is the presence of intracellular muscle fat. And you're also creating a storage place for glycogen. So when glucose comes in, it can be stored as more and more glycogen because you just have more storage room for that glucose, which won't end up as fat in your liver and fat in your fat cells. So you need to add muscle. But being sedentary is a problem, and aging compounds that. As we know, we lose muscle with age. Okay? So the second thing to do is cardio, because this has a separate, independent, and important effect on how you use energy. It improves the function and density of something called your mitochondria. So let's look at the muscle cell. This is an illustration that I did. I took this and I put the channel in. So when you exercise, all of a sudden you open up this hallway and all the glucose goes in and voila, you get to use it. Brilliant. Adding muscle is easier said than done, isn't it? How many people have tried and stopped and started and failed and been frustrated because they do all this stuff, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything? Unfortunately, as much as I'd love this to be a simple thing, it often requires a certain degree of education. How to lift properly so you do it safely and you can continue doing it without injury, but also how to do it with enough intensity. Because if you do it so lightly that it's not doing anything, some people don't lift weights that are even as heavy as the appliances in their kitchen, like the bread maker or whatever they lift from the bottom to the top shelf. You clearly need to lift heavy weights to build muscle. Otherwise, the muscle won't be challenged. So there is a bit of learning that's often needed. Find a way to do that. Lift a minimum of twice a week, minimum. And in those sessions, you need to make sure you're using all your major muscle groups. The bigger the muscles that you use, the better. Sitting there doing bicep curls is not as effective for someone who's only doing this twice a week as using those big back and chest and shoulder muscles in the upper body, and the glutes, thighs, and your hamstrings in the lower body. And fundamentally, whatever you do has to be something you can keep doing forever. So there's no sense going, super stormy on some kind of online program that then comes to an end, or you can't keep going with it. It takes time to build muscle is the first reality. And the second thing is, once you've gained it, you have to keep it. You don't get to keep it. It's not a trophy. So you have to work to keep it. Zone 2 cardio. This is we're going to talk about what zone 2 means, but I just want to tell you what the special part of this type of cardio is. It's the level of work that stimulates the function of the mitochondria. These are the cellular batteries that generate a lot of ATP. So people who are fit, generally you look at them and you're like, how do they have that much energy? They have more mitochondria per cell, and the mitochondria they have work very well. They have more enzymes, better enzymes, and exercise in zone 2 cardio does this. It rebuilds these cell batteries. And those batteries work by taking fat that's released and using it to generate ATP. There's no good releasing fat if it has nowhere to go. If you just, and some fat burning medications that you can take as a pill, that's what they do. They stimulate lipolysis, meaning they break the fat down, release it into the bloodstream. Where do you think it goes from there? I mean, energy cannot be just dissipated into the universe. Yes, they get warm, so they get hot, and some of it's dissipated as heat. But by and large, it has nowhere to go because these people aren't fit, and there's nowhere, the mitochondria are not taking that fat and turning it into ATP, so it just goes right back into the fat store where it came from. You need to give it a destination. Sorry. So zone 2 is a level of cardio that for most people is unfortunately more than just a walk. It's at the very least a brisk walk, probably on a little bit of a hilly terrain. Certainly having poles to walk helps because it has to incite a degree of breathlessness that leads to clipped phrases. So you could carry on a conversation, but chances are you'd prefer not to. So after saying sort of a little bit, you'd be like, okay, it's your turn to talk now. You need to work at this in bouts of 10 minutes or more. Every little bit counts. So the trouble people run into is, well, I don't have time to go out for an hour, but it doesn't have to be that. Think about changing certain little things throughout your day, walking to do errands, parking further away, getting off the bus or subway 2 stops early, introducing more opportunities to elevate your heart rate and get into that zone 2. Take the stairs every single time. And folks, there is no bad weather, just bad clothing. We say that in Canada because if you live here, you have to come to terms with that. So either get the right clothing or get something in the house that'll allow you to get this done. It's a medical prescription, really. I'm going to go on to the role of diet because clearly this is really what's pushed in media. It's like, get to the bottom of this by changing your diet. I don't want you to read the slides. I want you to listen to me. Remember that the inciting problem is the thing that you have to focus on the most. Meaning, how did I get into this mess? Or how might I get into this mess? It's by it's not because you're eating specific foods all the time. Carbs versus fat versus, you're missing the big picture. It's overconsumption of energy. Okay, that is the problem. And the reason why, so the foods that are most problematic are the highest energy density foods that are out there, and those are processed foods. Foods where the energy has been packed in to make it tasty. It came in a package, or it's prepared at a fast food restaurant, or it's even done at a nice restaurant, frankly, but they really want you to come back, so they're going to make it taste like amazing. So when you think about undoing that, you just have to think about, or preventing that, you have to think about doing the opposite. So yes, we change our sedentary behavior by moving more, and we move in both muscular activation ways and cardio activation ways. Then when it comes to eating, think about whether or not your diet is basically high enough in simple foods that are the basis of any good nutrition plan and tend to keep you out of the danger zone with overconsumption. Nobody ever overate broccoli salad to the point of, you know what I mean? So the more of these foods we eat, the less we run into an energy excess problem. And the term like energy toxicity, nutrient toxicity is something that you'll hear people talk about. We live in an energy toxic environment, meaning there's just too much energy around based on the types of foods we eat. Go back to the basics. Eat 5 or more servings of vegetables a day. Limit foods with combinations of refined carbs and saturated fats together. Those tend to be the most dangerous types of foods. Judicious choices when eating outside of the home, and because there's always a better option. Increasingly, there are healthier sort of prepared options and semi-prepared foods. And really watch that alcohol and sugary beverage intake, okay? And I would say that based on all the coaching that I've done in nutrition over the years, and as a health coach, the vast majority of people still have so much work to do on these foundational basics. And yet they're getting caught up in the rabbit holes because people want to sell you a fast fix. And so if you think about it, sure, if you don't eat any fat and you don't eat any sugar, then your insulin probably won't go up. But the minute you eat it again, have you fixed anything? It's always shocking to me that people are all about keto, low carb. That is like putting a bandage on a bleeding wound. You can hide the bleeding wound if it makes you feel better, but the minute you remove the bandage, it's still there. And that's exactly what we're doing when we fail to tell people what's going on at the root, which is really, really important. And that's where exercise absolutely 1000% trumps diet in dealing with this. Because people who are fit and active have metabolic flexibility, right? What does that mean? They have the ability to take a vast array of different nutrient types and fluctuations in the amount of food they eat, and seemingly not have as much of a problem storing fat that easily. And I think having listened, and hopefully having listened to why their insulin responses are so good, and they're so responsive because they have a high level of muscle mass. They have high sensitivity to the insulin. They have a large sink for glucose so that it's not going to fat. If you have no muscle, then the glucose has nowhere else to go. And then when you eat fat on top of that, it's just way too much energy for what your body needs. They also, have mitochondria that then know how to generate energy and take fat. If you don't have that machinery underneath, you're going to spend your entire life wearing a bandage. You're going to spend your entire life trying to find the right diet. And fundamentally, you're not fixing anything underneath. So can diet be an important adjunct? Yes. Do you have to get nutso weirdo? No. You just have to do these foundational things that really, frankly, in my own experience, most people are not doing very well. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. When I dig into people's history, they still have alcohol that's present too often. They still rely on convenience foods a little too much. And if you want to do better, you'll just slowly work at that, right? While you're walking up a hill. Who needs more aggressive intervention? I'm not going to be overly flippant about this. And I'm not being flippant. I don't think I'm being flippant. I just want you to understand the relative importance of exercise versus these minutiae, these ridiculous dietary trends that really have relatively much less of an impact on healing your body, which is what you want to do. You want to heal it. You don't want to wear a bandage or take a medicine. And these dietary interventions are much like taking a pill. They're just faking it. Now, people who need that and who may even need medication, obviously, are people who have gone too far down the path, right? If you have fatty liver, if you already have evidence of disease and organ disease, it might take on a level of urgency that you cannot wait to just implement the exercise alone. You might need higher levels of intervention. And in those people, dietary, supervised and guided medical, like prescriptive medical nutritional advice is probably warranted. So in some populations, clinical populations, they use keto diets, they use fasting protocols that are very aggressive, but these people are followed in a clinic. Playing around with those kinds of interventions is like saying, well, if I had access to metformin and Ozempic as a person who's, just not willing to exercise, I would also try that too. I don't think that's the approach anyone should be taking. So my suggestion, even for those people, obviously, is very much commit to exercise, seek medical attention for dietary, like medical dietary advice. Okay, so a dietitian at this point, not the Instagram people. And that includes me. I count myself out. I'm not in this category of nutritional, like I can guide you and I understand things, but you need some higher level of intervention. So do people who have habit-based eating. So if they can't stop themselves because they feel psychologically pulled to eat, that again requires a specific important intervention. No diet's going to fix that. So I want people to get on the right track and get the help that they need. But one of the most important things you can probably think about doing, and actually everyone can, now I say everyone, but athletes probably aren't in this category. If you're training like an athlete, that you're not in this category, but you probably don't have this problem either. But no eating after dinner plus an evening walk is a magic solution if there ever is one. And guess what? It's totally free with no side effects other than maybe a grumpy partner who you're going to drag along with you. So insulin resistance is very common, folks. It starts with fat accumulation in muscle cells from being sedentary. Caloric excess, meaning eating more energy than your body needs on a chronic basis, definitely compounds that. But prevention and treatment should definitely always prioritize weights and cardio. It's not one or the other, it's both. Diet plays a significantly helpful role in managing total energy consumption. You should think about lowering saturated fat and your processed carb consumption, usually present in restaurant takeout, snack foods, less present in healthy whole cooked meals at home. Consider eating dinner a little earlier, taking an evening walk that's somewhat brisk, activate those channels, and avoid eating again after you come back in and before you go to bed. So I hope this was an enlightening conversation. And I'm welcoming any questions. I finished exactly on time. If you have to go off, then thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. And I hope it made sense. It got a little sort of sciencey, but I think I managed to maybe break it down. If any of you want to stay behind for questions, I'm happy to stay. You're very welcome, Sonia. Thank you so much for joining. Yes, Liz Bardowell asks the very first question, is the recording available for us to rewatch? It is a lot of information, isn't it? And I'm going to have to find a way to, you're welcome, Christian. Thanks for joining. I'm going to find a way to upload it to YouTube and make this public because I think it's really, really important. And I think most people would like to know this, right? So it should be common public knowledge and it will help people get more active, I think. Donna?
I hate to keep raising my hand, but the thing
I love it.
Well, the thing you talked about the brisk walk after eating, that is, I mean, because my husband and I met your mom on a trip to Tancook Island to do road cooking last year. Yes. And anyway, so I'm there in Nova Scotia half the year. I'm in North Carolina right now. But we have done a lot of walking, but we don't generally do it right after we're eating. So can you explain like how soon afterwards? I mean, is there a real trick to trying to get the most out of when you walk? Because I've never heard anybody talk about when you walk.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, if you think about the physiology, let's just go back and answer our own question here. So after you eat, you remember that our blood sugar rises and peaks at about an hour after the meal. So if you're trying to blunt that rise, let's imagine that you're someone who's concerned that you're already a little bit insulin resistant. And therefore, what will happen, as you recall, is your blood sugar rises a little too much after eating. And that peak is going to happen at about an hour. So my suggestion is to be walking at about that time, and it'll blunt that peak.
Okay. So basically, and because I do recognize a lot of the symptoms you're talking about with the insulin resistance, and my blood work has shown that as well. So you're saying about an hour after you eat, whatever time you eat, and there's not a specific better time to eat or anything like that, but just enough time early enough so that you still have time to wait an hour and then go on a brisk walk of about how long?
So to clarify, I would start my walk as early as half an hour after eating.
Okay.
And keep walking. If you can walk for a half an hour, you're covering, that peak. But if you can walk for an hour, even better. I don't know how long you're willing to walk. So that, the point is you want to be walking at the 1 hour mark. So after you've eaten.
Okay. That helps.
Does that make sense? So
it does.
You don't have to like wait an hour by your clock and then start walking. I would just head out within half an hour to an hour after you've eaten, in that window of time, and just kind of off you go and walk for 30 minutes if you can, longer if possible. Again, it comes down to that zone 2, right? You're also building mitochondria if you're doing it right. So yes, you're taking advantage of the short-term impact of opening the glucose channels, blunting that effect, which will have a tremendously positive impact on your health right there. But if you want to walk a little longer and briskly, you'll have the secondary advantage of building mitochondria in zone 2. So a level of breathlessness where, like you can speak, but someone would know if they were listening to you that you were doing something active. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and I just to finish, sorry, before the issue of timing of the meal, it's best if it's not super late, because fasting also has benefits, right? If you're not eating, your insulin has to come down eventually. Even like someone who has hyperinsulinemia or exaggerated release of insulin because their muscles are not quite responding. Remember, it's like banging on the door, so the levels are a little too high. Might take a little longer than 2 hours to come back down. But if you eat again, imagine that then you reintroduce even just a little snack, what's happening, or, like a sugary thing, or put some honey in your tea. What's happening is you're kicking insulin up again. And you don't want to do that. So you want to stay fasting. And if that fasting period goes on longer, you have a longer opportunity to do all the things that insulin doesn't do. So insulin blocks lipolysis or breakdown of fat. Well, the longer you can keep insulin off, the longer you're in a fat burning state, meaning you have to rely on your stored energy. So why not lengthen that? So I often tell people, try to push dinner as early as you can. Go for that walk. So clean up your kitchen, and then as soon as that last dish is done, out the door you go, around the block or down the road or whatever you can do. Make it brisk if you can. Keep it about half an hour at the shortest, and then come back in. Go to bed after that. Go take your bath. Go have a nice, read your book. Do some relaxing stuff. Try not to go back on your computer if you can avoid it. And your health will be, even that one sequence of habits, if you could nail that in.
Okay. Now I want you to do one more thing.
Yeah.
It might be hard, but you can try. We all have smartwatches.
Yes.
Or our phone. And is it 10,000 steps? I know it's more about the briskness, and they are heart monitors now. So where do you want your heart on those things? If you could see, now we got the formula. If you could tie it to this little machine that can tell us if we're meeting our goals, it's just, boy, does that make it just makes it doable. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. So yeah, it's, I'm not gonna say step count isn't important. It is. People who step more than 8,000 steps a day live longer than people who don't, or who step less than 2,000. So we know step count is relevant. It's a surrogate for being more active. And I'd rather see you do a little better than 8,000 as the minimum. To me, that's just, you're not paying attention to zone 2 if you're just walking. And I want you to make it count. So do the minimum, but do it at least a zone 2 pace. So I don't know if that makes sense. You're not going to be able, your watch is not going to tell you that Tina's proud that you did. Like, I don't have the readout, but your heart rate is, what I want you to think about is your level of energy expenditure. Like, how hard does it feel? And it should just feel a little bit tougher than an easy stroll. Like, it really should be something that creates a bit of breathlessness. So it's hard for me to tell you what heart rate to target, but it would be, say, if I had to guess, 120 would be a good target to start, right?
Okay.
Now, if you're fitter, you can have a higher heart rate and still not be as breathless. Like, so it really depends, right? But that would be like, you want to work at that level. So normal people walking around don't work at that heart rate, right?
Okay,
So
that
try to be
helps. Thank you.
about it. It gives you a bit of a target.
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome. Great questions. Thank you. Thinking about action. You're action-minded. You're thinking about solutions, and I really like that. But this will be a reminder of why you're doing what you're doing. And I find that that is so critical to helping people commit. So if you feel your motivation failing you, listen to this. I'll send it back out to you so that you can listen to it while you're walking. And I don't know, even when I was preparing this talk, I started to double down on my commitment to being an advocate for physical fitness, because, you know, it's, anyway, people want to discuss their nutrition so much, but they're not exercising enough. And I think that that is the wrong message. And yeah, and even I, during my week of low energy, said, you know what, those mitochondria are waiting for you, and those muscle cells need you. And so then I started moving. And I think it really helps you to keep that in your mind as to why you're doing this. It's not vanity, folks. It's health first. Okay, any other questions? Can I help anyone else with a question? I see something in there's lots of comments, mostly seemingly thanking, and not a lot of questions. Okay. Well, if you do come up with questions that you didn't think of now, feel free to email me, okay? And of course, I'm not going to lie. I'd love to have some of you ladies join my lifting course, my lifting program. Many of you have already left who are in it, or those of you remaining are already in it. But if you know anybody who might benefit, then we work together to get women lifting. Okay? Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
How do you leave?